But as you all know, that all good things come in small packages. So firstly, let me say how privileged I am to be here and to thank Dr. Otto and Dr. Merck for this invitation and opportunity. Because I come from the other side of the world, sometimes I can say unspeakable things. So the first unspeakable thing I want to say to all of you Germans is that you're the most respected people in the world. Do you know this? And I know that in Germany, you're not sent to say anything. You know, when you win the World Cup, you're not supposed to celebrate too much. So I just want you to know that last month, there was a global survey about which is the most respected country in the world. And actually Germany. I don't know if the German papers published it, whether it's against... I suspect your liberal sort of politically correct narrative means you cannot say this. So I just want to say that you're the most respected, and I want to congratulate you. Okay. Now, I'm not saying nice things now because I want to get favor from you before I say all the horrible things. But I just wanted to acknowledge this. One of the things that at the last session we had was, I think the question, if I understood the translation, was essentially, should we do things more here? And then I think the overall consensus was that you should do more things here. And I absolutely agree that you should do a lot of things here rather than suggest that you should do things elsewhere, because this is the engine room of your economy, and I think we had a lot of data about how that affects the world, so you should. The only bad news is it doesn't matter what you do. This is the problem. Okay? So I'm going to state the problem rather differently, which is, can 5-6 billion Asians live like Europeans and Americans? I think the answer is very clear. I think the Germans have a word for it. It's called kaputt. The game is over if 5-6 billion try to live like Westerners. The problem is nobody wants to tell the Asians they can't. So no Western sort of political leader, green economy people will dare say this, because then they'll be accused of being terrible racists and things. And of course, Germans cannot say any of these things. You've been told, please do not say anything. So, but please speak up. This will be good. So the problem is, I'm being slightly flippant, but you can do everything you want, and it's very important you do it. But in the global context of sustainability, it doesn't matter. So people ask me a lot of times, so you mean the Americans don't have to change? I say, well, they can't change. Not in the time that we need it to be. And every day, as every day goes by, my view is being strengthened by the acts of the Tea Party, the Republicans. And this week, you all know I'm right. The system is broken. The only problem is that system affects us all. And this is the problem that we have. So, but let's assume there's enlightenment in the United States. I know all of you Germans thought when the black guy came into politics and became the president, I can say this, maybe you can't say it this way, you all gave him prime space in Berlin. And I said to all my German friends, you're making a mistake. He's still an American president. He can't change the system. So people thought after George Bush, the bar is very low. Anybody else must be better. So they made Barack Obama a Nobel laureate. And now we know that the system is broken. The point I'm trying to make is, though, that in 2050, the world's population will be about 10 or 12 billion, give or take billion, you know. We are not sure. The Western world's population will only be 10%. And so even if enlightenment comes to the United States, it's more likely to come to Europe, led by Germany, hopefully. It's unlikely to make any difference. The difference will have to be made in Asia. Not because the Asians do Tai Chi and yoga, and some of them are not so rich and drive bicycles, but only because for one reason, too many. Just too many. Now, the difficult discussion about sustainability is it's become politically correct, And you ask the right questions, substance or content. And I've been horrified by how in the corporate world the sustainability debate has been overtaken by PR consultants. People who don't know what carbon dioxide's chemical formula is, but now want to talk about how to do carbon trading. They even got banks to believe that they can be carbon neutral. The only carbon neutral people I have met are some gatherers in the forests of Kalimantan, the pygmies in the Congo, maybe the Bedouins in the Sahara, but there is no such thing as carbon neutrality. This is a lie. Public relations, as you said, has taken over substance and truth. So one of the greatest challenges of our times is that intellectual dishonesty now is the main currency. Is the main currency of many forums where very few people are willing to say anything truthful because maybe you don't get invited back. I know you don't invite speakers back, but I hope you'll at least maybe invite me back to sit in the row next year. But getting invited back has become essentially the handcuffs of many forums. I have the opportunity to go to many places, and I find that some of the things I say immediately risk making me the kind of instant pariah, the mongrel in the audience, the dog that should leave through the back door. But of course, in the last few years, this has changed, and this is a good thing. And that's why I come here to try and say the world looks differently, and I applaud you all for having that intellectual honesty to have the conversation you had this morning, which I thought was extremely refreshing. And I honestly say this, in very few places do I hear this sort of stuff. So sustainable development and all of that now has become sort of buzzwords for everybody. I said this last night. Everyone's got a sustainable development plan. And even the US Army's got one. I have no idea what it means, but it could be carbon neutral drone strikes in Afghanistan. So you see, I'm very straight up. It could be vegetarian halal meals in Guantanamo Bay. We don't know, drip fed, okay? But the nonsense has become so endemic that people have forgotten what we mean. So I would challenge you all to think about it slightly differently and say that, I come from the private sector as well. I live in Hong Kong, so I cannot be a hippie, okay? I'm not a greenie. I pay some of the highest rents in the world. So I'm not a hippie, I'm not Greenpeace, I don't smoke marijuana on the weekend, and I don't eat yogurt and drive on a bicycle with sandals. I come from a different world. But I think we need to have a very different conversation about the world we live in. And we need to dismantle the narrative which has dumbed down much of the debate on sustainability. But simply put, the idea that companies can lead the charge on sustainability is an oxymoron. Not because companies are bad. Companies are very good. They are very important. But sustainability, as the two speakers before talked about, is essentially the issue of how do we trade public good in the interest of prosperity. I'm not going to use the word economic growth. How do we trade it? Public good is not the mandate of companies. Public good can only be the mandate of the state. So now we have situations where even green groups have junk food companies on their boards. I won't name the green groups, but you know. To the extent that junk food companies now say they have sustainability interests. They're going to substitute junk food with a lettuce in your takeaway. This is a lie. And this is fundamentally what we have to challenge. What I think is very important is to know what companies can do and do well and allow them to do that better, but to not allow governments and public policy and civil society members, which is part of what I call the institutions of the state, to abdicate their responsibility. And I go to many forums, including the World Economic Forum, etc., and I am frightened and scared by how many people in the public policy arena, government officials, all have been seduced by the idea that somehow some company is going to deliver on the public good in their countries, in their cities. I've sat in discussions about cities, and you've all heard about sustainable cities, etc., and all these initiatives of energy efficiency. It's all more about technology rather than the fact that we need to redefine how we how we run those cities. But mayors after mayors will all say, oh, technology will solve these problems. Most of these people live in small cities in the Western world. They dominate the narrative. I have been at sessions where the people from MIT are always invited to talk about the great technologies they have that will apparently help ease congestion in Mumbai, Delhi, Chengdu, Beijing, etc. Well, Boston is a small village. The experiments they have conducted are in villages in the developed world. They don't understand the scale of the complexity of the dilemma of the cities in Asia. So I think we need to deconstruct. So that's my main point I'd like to make. I have one slide which I'd like to therefore now get into to essentially show why I think the 21st century will be different, why Asia will need to do things very differently, and in doing that it might in fact reject, and it'll have to reject, the Western narrative around what progress looks like, and it's also its liberal democratic obsessions. At this point, please don't ask me to leave. And this is the important point. So the first thing I'd like to, and this is, I hope you will see where I'll come to the conclusion. The first thing is, of course, population, and you all say, okay, population, we all know there are too many people anyway. But actually, the numbers are very interesting to know. Anyone here know when the human population reached 1 billion people? About 200 years ago. So thousands of years of human civilization. And then it reached 2 billion about 100 years ago. Then, of course, like bacteria, if anyone's a microbiologist here will know, like bacteria, we flourished. Okay? And then we reached 7 billion about 2 years ago. And now the expectations are by the 2050, the population of the world would be 10, 12 billion maybe. But the interesting thing is that this is the first time in human history, the human population, the species, which is the most voracious, most rampant species on the planet, is about to reach a peak and then decline. When that happens is everyone's guess. Why it'll happen is also part of the guess. But clearly, the one that we want to avoid is obviously the decline due to lack of resources and, of course, uncontrolled climate change. But the decline that will come through the natural sort of lowering of fertility and the demographics, that would be a nice thing. How we manage that transition is, I think, the challenge of the 21st century. This is the most important thing. The second is climate change, and there are people here who know much more about it than me, but only to point out that the science is now very clear. Everything is up for change. I think 2 weeks ago, the IPCC came up with this report, etc. The critical thing to understand here is that I think about 3 months ago, of course, the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere for the first time reached 400 ppm. This has not happened in millions of years. So everything we know about how our civilizations, our societies have been organized are about to change because the climate will change the distribution of flora, fauna, distribution of rain, etc. And those of you who have some background in fisheries, etc., will know there's a lot of work going on that's tracking how the distribution of pelagic species, etc., is shifting. Not to mention, of course, the fact that we have, through our voracious appetite for fish, almost cleansed many of the oceans. But the distribution, so the point is the 21st century is when everything changes from our acceptance of stable conditions. This has never happened before, never. Electronic intermediaries to go and talk to people. And I don't do the other thing, what's it called, Twitter? No, Twitter. And yesterday we found out that this company is going to be IPO'd for several $billion, no earnings. I like to be in a business like this. You know, I think there's a word for it too. It's called Ponzi Scheme. Anyway, but we have too much technology for our own reach, for our own good. And given the context of this discussion, I would just talk about a thing I wrote about a year ago, looking at fossil fuels in particular. So we have now so much ability to extract rather than to use technology to allow us to live within our means. And the fossil fuel area is the best example. 10 years ago, there were perhaps about 10 wells that could go down a mile deep in deep water. And 10 years ago, when climate was being discussed seriously, and those of us who said, we need to do something, we were told by the tech geeks that there would be a technological solution. It was called carbon capture, to sequester carbon, etc. The Norwegians, I think, were the prime innovators in that area, etc. Last week, the Norwegian government said, no more carbon capture, can't happen, too expensive. The technology cannot be replicated on a large scale. 10 years on, we have more than 200 deep wells around the world that don't go just 1 meter, 1 mile deep, they can go 3 miles deep. And if you're in the United States now, we have shale gas, which has technology that allows you to go this way, round the corner, and maybe light your cigar in your bedroom with natural gas. That's how creative we have become. But in terms of addressing the issues of constraints, we have made hardly any technological process. Why? Because the complete economic model in terms of investments and the direction of investment is to perpetuate to live beyond your means and to postpone the inevitability that we can't live, that we should live within our means. So when everyone says technology will solve the problems, I say I can give them a list of 10, 20 things where technology has exacerbated the problem rather than solved the problem. And we live in that illusion that technology will solve the problems. And just to reassure you, I'm not a Luddite. I'm an engineer, so I understand a bit of technology, and I'm not anti-technology. But we have to understand the limits of where we're going with technology as well. But our institutions are not able to cope with this. So I would just want to say that from the point of view of Asia, the problem now is that the economic model that was finessed and refined in the West is now being promoted all around the world. So this morning's discussion, I think, is very good about how do we supply chains, how do we preserve nature, etc. But the bigger problem is our refusal to accept that we have to constrain human beings. Of course, this doesn't go down well in Western liberal democracies. So for instance, I have argued that car ownership is not a human right. Right? So when I say this in the United States, they think I'm undercover Taliban. They think maybe I'm a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party, you know, from one of those minority groups in Xinjiang. I took my beard away and now I've become subversive. That I don't understand freedom. Frankly, car ownership is not a human right. So let me give you an example about why we need in Asia to reject the notion of growth and economic growth through consumption and, of course, debt. That's where we are in the world. The United States is essentially living beyond its means and fueled by debt. Buying things you don't need with money you don't have. Yeah? And if you're middle class, to impress people you don't like. It's kind of more or less where the story ends. So now we have, in our economic model, some of our brightest people finding out ways to essentially allow you to go to the supermarket to buy things you don't need with money you don't have, and then even better, buy one and get one free. You all been to the supermarket? You all know this, right? Things you don't need, you can get one extra, and then you can throw it away because you can't consume it. How did this work? It's called Voodoo Economics. Taught at Harvard Business School and all the best schools in the world. And then the purveyors of this become the best consultants in the world, the McKinseys, the Boston Consulting Groups, etc. I hope you are not seduced by these ideas. So if you look at the consumption model, it's broken, clearly, but we are trying to pretend that we can carry on. The problem in the Western world is this contradiction that you mentioned. On one hand, they're delighted that all these Asians now want to be like the West. So on one hand, it's schizophrenic. Hey, so good. We can sell them all our stuff. Handbags, cars, washing machines. We can sell them. So many of them. This is 100 years to fulfill. On the other hand, oh my God, is this a good thing? And they all want to be like us. And by the way, they're coming to our country and buying up everything as well. So this is a schizophrenic sort of thing. And of course, the xenophobia is mainly extended to the Chinese because, you know, they're not democratic. So they must be the worst people in the world. But we need them. We need them to sell them more junk. Right? Now in Asia, the idea is, and you have to look back at history a bit, around the 1960s when the decolonization process started after the end of the Second World War, where essentially, in my view, the Second World War was a cannibalization within the Western world of its need to control world resources. After the Second World War, the Asians said, hey, we want you out. So the Indonesians told the Dutch, we want you out. The Indians told the British, we want you out. But the elite in Asia said, we want you out, but we want to be like you. Because they all went to the Western schools, the elite. So they didn't realize the dilemma. Now go back 30 years ago, and still much of the world saw India and China, which I think is how the second half of this century is going to be shaped. So never imagine that 2 billion Chinese and Indians may actually all get rich and want to be like you and me. This is now the dilemma. The problem is, having sold them the lie that they can all be rich and live like Europeans, the truth is they can't. And so what I go around saying is, they can't, it's not possible, and in pursuit of this illusion, they will destroy the world. They will destroy the world. Because there's just too many. I'll give you one example, cars. I know you Germans all like your cars, and you make the best cars in the world. You know, the car ownership levels in the OECD countries are about 750 cars per 1,000 people. China is already the world's largest car market. Anyone been to a Chinese city recently? Shanghai, Beijing? Many people here? Yeah. So Chinese car ownership levels are about 175 per 1,000 people. India, which hasn't really become a big car market, is about less than 50, 35. But if you've all been to an Asian city, you will all know that we need cars in Asian cities like I need a hole in my head. Yes? But we're all being told in Asia, this is the trajectory. This is how the Western world grew. This is how the American dream was fulfilled, by car, mobility, individual freedoms, and we can all be like that. And of course, the economic model is also premised on the automotive industry being one of the foundations of industrialization. You all know this better than I. The problem is if all the Asians have cars levels taken for granted in the Western world, do you know how many cars there'll be in the world? 3 billion. This is not possible. But what are we being told? We are being told, don't worry, we'll have green cars. Right? This is science fiction, my friends. I call it Star Trek Plus. Go watch the movie. It is not happening. The technology is there, but just because the technology exists doesn't mean it can be commercialized and made available. And I won't depress you with stories about chickens. Or maybe I should. Today, meat consumption in Asia is still relatively low compared to the rest of the world. 350 million Americans today consume about 9 billion birds. That includes turkeys. It's coming up, right? 3.5 billion, 4 billion Asians consume something like 16 billion birds. What happens when you get richer? You start eating more protein. But you don't eat wild animals, you start eating industrial meat. And if Asians start to consume as much as Americans do in birds, by 2050, you know how many birds we will be consuming? 120 billion birds. I have no idea what that looks like. But I do know that industrial agriculture will produce those birds. And in that process, create a world that will be hugely distorted in terms of the natural resource base because they are highly compounded by steroids, vaccines, etc., that will produce these things. We can't do this. So sometimes I wake up at night dreaming there's a bird god, and the bird god releases all the birds on the same day, and the sun will be blocked out, the helicopters will crash, and we might realize that we all can't have birds, eat the levels of meat. And fisheries is the same problem. So fundamentally, I'm saying Asians can't have it. They can't consume at these levels. So what should we do? I will say that we need to really start to understand the contract that we have with our societies. And I come down to 3 or 4 key things that I think Asian governments, Asia should do. The first one is to reject the notion of capitalism as we know it, because today we have a crisis. And the crisis is very simply put, as I said before, capitalism as we know it today thrives on essentially getting you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have. That's the American model. It's being promoted all around the world. But to do that, you need to do something else. You need to externalize costs. You need to make sure that next year's or next month's kilo of meat is cheaper than last year's price. This is it's been turned into the language of competitive advantage. Give it respectability. Call it something sophisticated. But essentially, it's how to externalize costs, right? So I think in Europe recently you had horse meat in beef lasagnas. Do you remember? Did it affect Germany as well? Right. And, we used to think that this only happened with those terrible Chinese people. You all remember? Replacement of food and all. But it'll happen everywhere now. Why? Because the supermarkets have to continue to tell the consumer they can have everything they want, overconsume, and cheaper, that this is their right. And the consumer, of course, has been led to believe they are kings. Can I say politically that the average consumer is an idiot? Go to a supermarket. They don't care. Why should they? The geniuses working in the supermarket companies and supply chains have made sure I can get what I want cheaper. Next year's shampoo, cheaper than last year's price. When all of us know that the inputs to produce these goods and services has increased. So when the supermarkets in the UK force the beef producer to keep the price of beef lower, well, his Romanian friend walked in and said, hey, I got a horse that died yesterday. It's winter. It isn't smelling yet. Can we mix and match? But I say if they mixed it up with some curry, nobody would have found out. But my point is that this is happening on a worldwide scale in different things. And we cannot go on this way. So we have to start to look at what is the economic model of growth that we can live with, and accept that the majority of Asians cannot and should not aspire to live the lifestyles taken for granted in the West. Nobody wants to say this. I do my little bit by saying this loud and clear everywhere, particularly in Asia, to get people to understand. Because a key point I'd like you to also perhaps appreciate is so much in Asia, political leaders, business leaders are all subservient to the narrative out of the West. And it's maybe difficult for some of you to understand, but unless you have been colonized and sort of humiliated for 3 centuries, you can't understand why these people are also subservient. Why is it that we in Asia constantly welcome all of these guys from Texas, the guys who only speak one language, it's called Texan, right? And ask them to lecture us about the world is flat, who is free, who is not free. Why? Because we're subservient. We continue to send our best kids to the schools in the United States that teach them all the wrong things. We continue to. This is a subservience that is very difficult for some of you to perhaps understand. But why do middle-class Asians all want Western consumer goods? Why do they all want to pay $30,000 for a leather bag made in Italy? Which usually looks horrible, but, nice made. But this is a problem. So we have to start to think about it very differently and start to change the narrative. And changing narratives is not easy. But you have to change narratives. And in the last 5 minutes, I'll talk about a couple of things I think the narratives need to change. One is the rejection. Second is that we can't have it all. Third, the rejection of the business narrative coming out of the business school, which I think is actually anti-business, which suggests that somehow innovation, free markets, technology, and, of course, democracy will solve the problems of the world. This is a complete lie. It cannot solve the problems of the world, and we will need to have constraints imposed by societies, understanding that the world is going to be a very crowded place, and therefore we'll have to do things very differently. But the intelligentsia in Asia, the political intelligentsia and the business elite are very subservient, because for so many decades, they seek legitimacy through association with Western thoughts. That's how you get invited to the White House. Even for a while, that's only how you get invited to the World Economic Forum, if you say the right things. So this is very deep-rooted, and it's not been challenged. So I try to challenge it. And I want to suggest to Asians that aping the Western economic model will create catastrophic outcomes. Catastrophic outcomes not just in Asia, but around the world. And to Western business leaders and political leaders, I said, please don't wish for things you do not understand the consequences of. The problem is so many in the West don't understand the scale of the challenge in Asia. I've been to cities in China where 90% of Chinese never heard the name of the city or town. 90% of Chinese never heard. 99% of Europeans have never heard. Population? 3 million. If you had a city of 3 million in Europe, it'll be world famous. Everybody would know, yes? It'll be big places. So this is the scale, and there are hundreds of these places, and the scale of humanity. So I call for a couple of things. One is that we will need tough rules in Asia. We will have to reject the idea that free market capitalism with democracy will essentially solve these problems. And you will know that the business narrative coming out of this, which has sown the seeds of the crisis of capitalism, was this idea that somehow businesses will solve the problems of the world, and the main problem is too many rules. That rules are bad, that governments getting in the way of business will not solve the problems. Now, I am not calling for bad rules, but we will need to have rules. So one rule I think every Asian city will have, but they are perhaps postponing, is it, that private car ownership cannot be a right. Can't have it. And there are many other things that we have to do. So I call for Asia to essentially start to think about, what does prosperity look like? How do we price goods and services? And then ultimately, what are your rights? Challenging the idea that everyone can have everything, because they can't. And therefore changing the political discussion into putting the collective welfare ahead of individual interests. That the individual as king does not sit comfortably with the idea of shared resources in a very crowded place. And that we will have to have a very different way of defining, therefore, what progress looks like. And acknowledging that the economic model of trickle-down economics, which is essentially the Washington Consensus post-Second World War, is bankrupt. Because the gravy is too thick. It doesn't trickle down enough. So I'll finish by asking you to just ponder a few questions, and I'm happy to take some questions. So if we can't have everything, then how do we organize ourselves? Because it's all about organization. The wealth of the Western world created about 2-3 centuries ago was not based on individual enterprise. Essentially, the states were very organized. That's how they were able to control the resources of the world. And today we live in a world in which we have come to understand, at least in the Western world, that authority is a bad word. This is the privilege of liberal democracies, to have these intellectual discussions. But without authority, I would argue that in the most crowded part of the world, we will have chaos. we will have to have rules. So how do we organize ourselves? What are your rights? How do we create a new prosperity that is shared? Reject the old economic model of the West, which is based on entitlement, privilege, and extraction, and underpricing of resources, essentially. And finish off by saying, therefore, to capture the essence of that debate, and I don't pretend to have all the answers, is to say, if you look at Asia, there's probably 3 countries that are critical: China, India, Indonesia. One has a population of 1.3, one has a population of 1.2, which India is going to surpass China and be at somewhere at 1.5 billion people. And then Indonesia, which has a population today of about 250 million, which may peak at about 400 million, okay? But let's just take China and India so that I can sort of perhaps tickle all of you a bit. So if you're poor today, after all, sustainability in Asia is essentially confronted by how do we raise the basic rights to live of the majority who are disenfranchised. Most people in the United States today think all the Asians have become rich. They think all the Chinese are rich. Actually, the amount of Chinese who are consuming is still a small portion of the entire population. But, you know, as I remind people, 2% of Chinese is a lot of people. Yeah? 5% of Chinese is 75 million people. What's the population of Germany these days? About? Right. So 5% of Chinese is a lot of people already. There's a lot more to come. Okay. So, but if you're poor today, would you rather be Chinese or Indian? I think I know the answer. Right? One is a democratic state which has failed its people, and one is not so democratic, but anathema to the West. But they need them because they need to sell them stuff. But which has probably served its people more. So who has delivered more human rights? China or India? That too is the hard question that people don't like to confront. But I'm happy to take a lot of questions about this. So with that, I'll finish and happy to engage in a discussion. Thank you very much.